Now, before we'll take a look under the hood of actions and see what create action does under the hood and which alternative code you could write, I also want to show you how you could attach data to your actions. Because it is quite common that actions should carry some data with them. For example, in this very simple demo application here, you might not always want to increase the counter by 1. Maybe you want to add 2 or 3 or 10 to it. So therefore, you might want to have a more dynamic action that can carry data. And since this is so common, that of course absolutely is a requirement that is supported by NGRX. Create action is able to take a second argument, which in the end would be an object that describes the kind of data that can be attached to the action. And that's done with help of the extra props function that's provided by NGRX store. Here, for this second argument that's passed to create action, you can execute props as a function. And now the important thing is that you add angle brackets here, since props is a generic function, to describe the kind of data that can be attached to the action. And this typically is an object where you could add a key named value, though this key name is totally up to you. And you then define the kind of data that can be attached to the action. For example, here it would be a number. But this can be anything. If this would be an action related to user authentication, you could instead have an email and a password, which both are of type string. So you really just describe the shape of the data that should be attachable to the action. In this case, the value of type number by which the counter should be incremented. So that's how you prepare an action when using create action for data being attached. To extract this data, you then go to your reducer, and there in this function that will be triggered when this action occurs, you can accept a second argument, an action argument. And just as the state value, this action value will be fed in automatically by NGRX, because NGRX is the thing that executes this function. Now this action thing, which we're getting here, turns out to be an object that has a type property, and that will simply be the identifier of the action, but it then also has a value property. And it's value here in my case because I named this key here value when defining the kind of data that can be attached to an action. If you chose a different key here, you have to use a different key here when extracting that data. So that's how you can extract data from that action. How you define the data and how you then extract it. And with this in the counter controls component, we now would have to pass the data that should be attached to the action when calling the action here as a function inside of dispatch. In this case here, it should be an object with a value key that could be 2 to increment the counter by 2, or 5 to increment it by 5, whatever you want. Here I'll go with 2. And with that, if you run ngserve, you will see that if I reload and I click increment, the counter now is incremented by 2 every time I click this button. And of course, hopefully unsurprisingly, this code is exactly the same no matter how you're building your application. So I can then also copy over my actions code into the counter actions TS file and do the same for the reducer, and the code is exactly the same no matter if you're using standalone components or Angular modules. So you now learned about actions. Earlier in this section, you learned about reducers and this alternative way of defining your reducer functions. And now I want to come back to this alternative approach. I want to redefine this reducer, which now does contain some state-changing logic, using this syntax, so without create reducer. And I want to do the same for the action and show you how you could build such an action thing, such an action function as you learned, since this action is executed like a function inside of the component that should dispatch it, I want to show you how you can build it without create action. And of course, don't get me wrong, it's absolutely recommended to use create action and create reducer unless you really don't like that syntax. But as you're using your knowledge you gain in this course on real-world projects, you could encounter a project that does not use this syntax, that does not use create reducer and create action. And that's why I'm showing you this alternative syntax, though I'm of course also showing this syntax to you because it allows you to understand what's going on under the hood. So let's start with the reducer. Instead of creating it with create reducer and by using this on function, which is provided by ngrx store, you can create your reducer as a standard function, as you learned before. And now in a reducer where we don't just want to return the state that we already have, you can accept a second argument in this reducer. And that second argument simply is the action that was dispatched. Now in theory, a reducer can handle any action dispatched anywhere in the application. Of course, in this application we only have one action thus far, but this could change over time. So therefore, to make TypeScript happy, for now, I'll simply set the type of action to any, though I will change this a little bit later. I'm just doing this right now to make our life a bit easier for the moment. Now, inside of the reducer, we now want to update the state depending on which action was dispatched. And if it's an action about which we don't care in this counter reducer, let's say a user login action which has no impact on this reducer, we want to return the unchanged state instead. And keep in mind that state here really only means this counter state here for this slice of the overall store. Keep in mind that the overall store is built by assigning reducers to keys, and then it's the combination of all these different reducers that makes up the overall store. But every reducer just handles its slice of the overall store, and it's the state of this slice that's managed by this counter reducer here, for example. So therefore here inside of the reducer, we want to take a look at the action that was dispatched and then determine if and how we want to handle this action. And how can we take a look at the action? Well, for example, with an if statement. We could check if action.type, and keep in mind that actions created with create action in the end will have such a type. Increment is a function which, when executed, gives you an object that has a type key. So we can take a look at that type of that dispatched action object, and we can check if the type here, for example, is equal to counter increment, so to this identifier, because this here will be the type of the action. The type of this action object, so this type here, will be counter increment. You can also see this here in the preview in my IDE. So therefore, we want to check whether the type is counter increment, and we'll refactor this code to reduce the danger of having a typo in here, for example, in a couple of seconds. But for the moment, that's what it is. And then in here, we know that we don't want to return the unchanged state, but instead here, we want to return the state plus 1, so the incremented counter. And that's in the end what we're doing here, though it should not be plus 1, of course, but instead action.value, because our action can carry a value, can carry the value by which the counter should be incremented, and therefore, if the action is counter increment, the new state that should be produced by this counter reducer should be the old state plus the value that's included in the dispatched action. On the other hand, if it's some unknown action type or an action type about which we simply don't care in this reducer, I return the unchanged state. And again, the state here is really just this slice of the overall store, this counter state here. And that's how we could build the counter reducer without using create reducer. If I restart this app after saving everything, and I then visit localhost 4200, you see that the increment button still works fine. However, this of course is not everything I want to do here. Instead, I mentioned that I also want to show you how you can avoid create action. And we'll then also come back to this code here and improve it a little bit. But let's start with the action here.